I pulled my coat tighter around my body as the wind cut through the alleyway. It was another night like many before, cold, lonely, and uncertain. My stomach ached from hunger, but I had learned long ago to ignore it. I sat on the curb outside a high-end restaurant, watching as men in tailored suits and women in elegant dresses laughed over their meals. That's when I saw him. A man who looked strangely familiar. Tall, well-groomed, and with an air of confidence, he walked out of the restaurant adjusting his watch as he headed toward a sleek black car. I didn't know why, but something inside me told me to approach him. "Excuse me, sir," I said, my voice hoarse from the cold. He barely looked at me. "I don't have spare change." "I don't want money," I replied quickly. I hesitated. "I think you might be my father." For the first time, he really looked at me. His sharp blue eyes scanned my face with an expression of disbelief, then irritation. "That's impossible," he said, shaking his head. "I don't have a son." My heart pounded. My mother's name was Angela Carter. His entire face changed. His confident demeanor faltered for just a second, but it was enough. He knew her. "Leave me alone," he muttered, stepping past me and getting into his car. I stood there frozen, watching as the car disappeared down the street. The truth sat heavy in my chest. He knew. He just didn't care. I wasn't sure why I had expected anything different. That night, I curled up in my usual spot beneath an abandoned storefront, hugging my thin blanket around me. I had been in and out of shelters for years, but none of them ever felt safe. My mother had passed away when I was 10, leaving me to bounce between foster homes and the streets. She had always told me stories about my father, a wealthy man who had never known about me. A man who, in her words, would have taken care of us if he had known. She had been wrong. The next morning I made a decision. If he wouldn't acknowledge me, I would find a way to prove the truth. I spent the next few weeks searching for any trace of him. His name was Daniel Whitmore, a real estate tycoon who had built an empire from the ground up. He had the kind of life I had only ever seen on TV. Mansions, fancy cars, and a perfect family. A wife, 2 kids. A world so far from mine that it felt like a different universe. But I didn't care about his wealth. I just wanted answers. One night, after weeks of watching from a distance, I finally worked up the courage to go to his office. The receptionist barely spared me a glance before shaking her head. "You can't be here," she said. "I need to see Mr. Whitmore. It's important." She sighed. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but..." "Then I'm sorry. You need to leave." Before I could argue, a familiar voice spoke behind me. "What is he doing here?" I turned to see him standing there, looking as cold and composed as ever. "I just want to talk," I said. "There's nothing to talk about." I swallowed hard. "Then take a DNA test," he scoffed. "I don't need a test to know you're lying." I clenched my fists. "Then prove it." His jaw tightened. He glanced at the receptionist, then at me. Finally, he let out a breath. "Fine, but when it comes back negative, I don't want to hear from you again." The results took a few days. I spent every moment feeling like my entire existence was hanging by a thread. A part of me still held on to hope, even though I knew I shouldn't. When the call finally came, I could barely breathe. There was silence on the other end, before a voice, clipped and professional, spoke the words that changed everything. "The test is positive. Daniel Whitmore is your biological father." I don't know what I expected after that. Maybe an apology, maybe some kind of acknowledgement. What I got was silence, and then a call from his lawyer, a settlement, money to go away. I stared at the check in my hands, my chest tight with anger and disappointment. This wasn't about money, it had never been. I tore the check in half and dropped it onto the floor. I had spent my entire life searching for a father, but I wasn't searching anymore. I didn't need him. I had survived without him, and I would keep surviving. I sat on the park bench, watching the golden hues of the sunrise spill across the city skyline. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh-baked bread from a nearby cafe. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel something close to hope. It had been a hard winter, but I was still here, still standing. I pulled my coat tighter around my frame, a tattered thing I had found in a donation bin weeks ago. It wasn't much, but it was warm. A reminder that even in the coldest moments, kindness still existed. As I took a deep breath, A little girl ran past me, giggling as she chased after her mother. The sight made something in my chest tighten, not in sadness, but in longing. A longing for something more. I wasn't meant to live like this forever. For years, I had drifted through life like a ghost, unseen and forgotten. But something in me had shifted lately. Maybe it was the way people still smiled at me when I held doors open for them, or how a stranger had once handed me a cup of coffee without expecting anything in return. Or maybe it was the simple realization that I deserved more. I had spent too long believing I was nothing, that I had been left behind, discarded. But I was tired of that story. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the only thing I had left from my mother, a faded photograph, its edges worn from years of being held too tightly. My mother's handwriting was scrawled across the back. Daniel Whitmore, a name I had spent years whispering to myself, a name I had tried to forget but couldn't. My mother had always told me he was a good man, that if he had known about me, he would have been there, that he would have loved me. I wasn't sure if I believed that anymore, but there was only one way to find out. I stood, tucking the photo safely back into my pocket. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the city in a warm glow. I took one last deep breath and started walking. Toward answers. Toward the truth. Toward the man who had unknowingly shaped my entire life. I pulled my coat tighter as I stood outside Whitmore Tower, my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The building loomed over me, all glass and steel, reflecting a world so far removed from mine that it felt untouchable. For years, I had wondered what it would be like to meet him, to stand face to face with the man my mother had spoken of with so much warmth and regret. Daniel Whitmore, a name that had once been nothing more than a whispered hope, a bedtime story she told me before I fell asleep in whatever shelter we'd found that night. But hope had a way of fading when reality set in. Still, I was here, and I wasn't leaving without an answer. I took a deep breath and walked inside. The lobby was quiet, polished floors gleaming under the fluorescent lights. A woman in a fitted blazer stood behind the reception desk, her eyes flicking to me the moment I stepped forward. "Can I help you?" Her tone was polite but distant, the way people spoke when they were already looking for a reason to turn you away. "I'm here to see Daniel Whitmore," I said, keeping my voice steady. She raised an eyebrow. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but..." "Then I'm afraid Mr. Whitmore doesn't see walk-ins." I expected that. I had rehearsed my response a dozen times, but now that I was standing here, my throat felt tight. "He's my father," I said finally. Her expression barely shifted, but there was something in the way she hesitated for half a second before glancing at the security guard by the entrance. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Whitmore is unavailable." I clenched my fists. "Just tell him my name, please." A voice behind me cut through the air like a blade. "What's going on here?" I turned and found myself staring at him. Daniel Whitmore. He looked exactly as I had seen him in magazines. Tall, composed, his suit perfectly pressed. But there was something colder about him in real life, something that made my stomach twist. His gaze swept over me, disinterested at first. Then he frowned, like he was trying to place me. "I told you I don't have spare change," he said, already turning away. Anger flared in my chest. "I don't want your money," I said. "I just want the truth." That made him pause. He glanced back at me, really looking this time. I could see the moment something clicked, a flicker of recognition, a memory maybe. "My mother's name was Angela Carter," I said, watching him carefully. There it was, the hesitation, the barely perceptible shift in his expression. But then, just as quickly, his face hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about." His voice was firm, final. I swallowed, my throat burning. "Then take a DNA test." He scoffed, shaking his head. "I don't owe you anything." Maybe not, but I had spent my whole life being told I was unwanted, being treated like I didn't matter. I wasn't going to let him do the same. "Then prove it," I said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "One test. If it's negative, I'll walk away." Silence stretched between us. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was weighing his options. Then finally he sighed. "Fine." It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was something. As I walked out of the building, My heart pounded in my chest. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was fighting for myself. The days after the DNA test were the longest of my life. Every hour that passed felt like an eternity, every second filled with the same unanswered question. What if? What if my mother had been wrong? What if he really wasn't my father? But then what if she had been right all along? What if I had spent my whole life without a father? Not because he didn't know about me, but because he had chosen to pretend I didn't exist. The thought made my stomach turn. I kept myself busy, doing odd jobs at a diner in exchange for food and a little money under the table. Washing dishes, sweeping floors, things no one else wanted to do. It wasn't much, but it kept me going. On the third day, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. My heart slammed against my ribs as I answered. "The results are in," a woman's voice said. "Daniel Whitmore is your biological father." I barely heard anything after that. The test had confirmed what I already knew, but hearing it spoken out loud was different. It made everything real in a way I wasn't prepared for. I waited for a call from him, some kind of acknowledgement, but it never came. Instead, I got a letter, a check, a settlement, a quiet way of saying, "Take this and disappear." I sat on the edge of my cot in the shelter, staring at the check in my hands. $500,000, more money than I had ever seen in my life, enough to change everything. But it wasn't what I wanted. I wanted answers. I wanted to know why he had ignored me, why he had let me grow up in the dark, why he had refused to even consider the possibility that I was his son until a piece of paper forced him to. Anger burned in my chest as I tore the check in half, the pieces falling to the floor. I wasn't going to disappear. I went back to Whitmore Tower the next day, not as a lost kid looking for a father, but as someone demanding the truth. When I walked into the lobby, the receptionist tensed, probably recognizing me from before. Before she could speak, I saw him. Daniel. He was stepping off the elevator, phone in hand, surrounded by men in suits. He looked up and our eyes met. For a moment, something passed between us, something unspoken, something heavy. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. I followed. Outside, I caught up to him on the sidewalk. "You think a check makes this go away?" He stopped, exhaling sharply. "I don't owe you anything." "You owe me the truth," I shot back. "You knew my mother. You knew the moment I said her name. Why did you abandon us?" His jaw tightened. "I didn't abandon anyone." "Then what do you call it?" He looked away, his hands curling into fists. For the first time, he didn't look like a man in control. He looked haunted. "It was complicated," he finally said. I scoffed. "It's not complicated. Either you didn't know, or you didn't care." Something in his expression cracked. He glanced around, lowering his voice. "This is not a conversation we're having on the street." "Then when?" I challenged. "Or are you just going to keep pretending I don't exist?" For a second, I thought he'd walk away. But then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Fine. Tomorrow, my office. One meeting. That's it." It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, I stood outside his office, my palms sweaty. I didn't know what I expected. An apology, maybe. An explanation. Instead, when I walked in, Daniel was already seated behind his desk, looking exhausted. He gestured for me to sit. "I didn't know about you," he said, cutting straight to the point. "Your mother never told me." I clenched my fists. "You expect me to believe that?" He exhaled. "I met Angela when I was young. It was brief. We had different lives. She never reached out, never told me she was pregnant. I only found out when you showed up." I wanted to believe him, but part of me still wasn't sure. "So what? You just assumed I was lying?" "You have to understand," he said, his voice quiet. "People have tried to scam me before. I've had men and women claim to be long-lost relatives. I had no reason to believe you." His words stung, but I understood. Still, it didn't change the fact that I had spent my whole life without him. I looked around his office, the bookshelves lined with awards, the family photos on the desk, his real family. "I don't want your money," I said. "I don't want anything from you." He studied me for a long time. "Then why are you here?" "Because a part of me still wanted a father. Because I had spent too many years pretending I didn't care when I did. Because I wanted to know if he could ever see me as more than just a mistake. But I didn't say any of that." Instead, I stood. "You promised one meeting," I said, "and now it's over." I walked out before he could stop me. Over the next few weeks, I tried to move on. I found a small apartment, got a steady job bussing tables, and started building something for myself. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. But then, one evening, my phone rang. "Daniel," I hesitated before answering. "I want to meet again," he said. I frowned. "Why?" A pause, then softer this time. "Because I think I owe you more than just one meeting." I didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time I felt something I hadn't in years. Hope. I met Daniel at a quiet cafe downtown, a place so different from the cold, corporate walls of his office. It was the kind of place where people lingered over coffee, where life felt slower, less calculated. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, stirring his coffee absently. When he looked up, his expression wasn't guarded like before. If anything, he looked tired. "I didn't think you'd come," he admitted. "I almost didn't," I said, sliding into the seat across from him. He nodded as if he understood. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, placing it on the table between us. A photograph. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. It was old, worn at the edges, just like the one I had of my mother. But this one was different. It was her. Younger, smiling, and standing beside her was Daniel. "You did know her," I whispered, my fingers hovering over the image. "Yes," he said quietly, "more than I let on." The world seemed to tilt for a moment. My entire life I had believed one of two things. Either he never knew about me, or he had known and chosen to ignore me. But this was something else entirely. "I loved your mother," he admitted, "but I was a different person back then. Young, reckless. We were together for a short time, and when things got complicated, I left." I swallowed hard. "She always said you didn't know." He hesitated. "That's not entirely true." His words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" "I didn't know for sure," he said carefully, "but she told me she was pregnant." I gripped the edge of the table. "And you just left?" He closed his eyes briefly as if bracing himself. "I was selfish. I had plans, ambitions. I told myself it might not even be true, that maybe she was just scared and looking for something to hold on to." I couldn't breathe. "You walked away," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You knew there was a chance, and you still walked away." Regret flickered in his eyes. "I did, and I've had to live with that choice ever since. I wanted to hate him. I should have hated him. But as I looked at him, this powerful, untouchable man who suddenly looked so human, I realized something. I had spent my whole life searching for a father, for a reason why I had been left behind. I had carried the weight of that abandonment like a wound that refused to heal. But maybe the truth wasn't just about him failing me. Maybe it was about me learning that his failure didn't define me. I had survived without him. I had built something for myself, no matter how small. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't that abandoned child anymore. I wasn't waiting for a father to save me. I had already saved myself. "I can't change the past," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I want to know you, if you'll let me." For so long, I had wanted those words, and now that I had them, I realized I didn't need them, not in the way I once had. I stared at the man across from me, the man who had unknowingly shaped my life with his absence. And for the first time, I saw him not as the missing piece of my story, but as just another flawed human being. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I admitted. He nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to." I exhaled slowly. "But I think I'd like to try." A slow, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his lips. And in that moment, I realized something else. This wasn't the ending of my story. It was just the beginning of a new one. The next few weeks passed in a blur of uncertainty. Daniel and I had agreed to try, but neither of us really knew what that meant. A part of me wanted to trust him, to believe that he truly regretted the years he had missed. But another part, perhaps the bigger part, reminded me that trust wasn't something freely given. It had to be earned. Still, I met with him. At first it was awkward, both of us circling around each other like strangers forced to share the same space. He asked about my life, my childhood, but I kept my answers short. I wasn't ready to open up completely, not yet. But one day something changed. We were having lunch at a quiet restaurant when he set down his fork and said, "I want to introduce you to my family." I froze. The words landed like a weight in my chest. His family, his real family. I forced my voice to stay even. "Why?" He hesitated as if carefully choosing his words. "Because you deserve to know them, and they deserve to know you." I looked down at my plate, my appetite suddenly gone. I had spent my whole life wondering if I belonged anywhere. And now here he was, offering me a place, offering to fit me in, like I was just another piece of his well-curated life. Did I even want that? Still, something in his expression told me this wasn't easy for him either. Maybe he was just as lost in this as I was. So against my better judgment, I agreed. The night of the dinner, I stood outside Daniel's house, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't just a house, it was a mansion. Gated, pristine, the kind of place that made it painfully clear just how different our lives had been. I almost turned around right then, but before I could, the door swung open, and a woman, Daniel's wife, stood there, her face carefully unreadable. "You must be Elijah," she said. I swallowed hard. "Yeah." She studied me for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." The inside of the house was even grander than I imagined. High ceilings, expensive paintings, furniture that looked like it had never been touched. Everything felt too perfect, too staged. And then I saw them. A teenage girl, maybe 16, sitting stiffly at the dinner table. A younger boy, around 10, fidgeting with his napkin. Daniel's other children, his real kids. The girl, Ava, looked me up and down, her expression unreadable. The boy, Henry, just stared, wide-eyed, like I was some kind of mystery. No one spoke for a long time. Then Daniel cleared his throat. "Why don't we eat?" The meal was tense. Every clink of silverware against porcelain felt deafening in the silence. Finally, Ava set down her fork and looked straight at me. "So, you're our brother?" Her tone was sharp, challenging. I forced myself to meet her gaze. "I guess so," she scoffed. "Funny, Dad never mentioned you before." I clenched my jaw, willing myself to stay calm. "He didn't know about me." She gave a humorless laugh. "Right," Daniel sighed. "Ava..." "No, it's fine," I cut in. I turned back to her. "You don't have to believe me. But I didn't come here to take anything from you." She narrowed her eyes. "Then why are you here?" And that was the real question, wasn't it? I glanced at Daniel. He was watching me carefully, waiting to see how I would answer. "I don't know," I admitted. "I spent my whole life wondering about him, about this..." I gestured vaguely around the table. "Now that I'm here, I'm still trying to figure it out." For the first time, something in Ava's expression softened, just a little. Henry, the younger boy, suddenly spoke up. "Do you like basketball?" I blinked at the unexpected question. Yeah." His face lit up. "Me too. Dad took me to a game last week." I stiffened at the mention of Daniel being a dad, an active dad to them, to Henry. Something tightened in my chest, but I forced a small smile. "That's cool." Henry grinned. "Maybe we can go together sometime?" Ava shot him a glare. "Henry." But Daniel surprisingly spoke up. "That's not a bad idea." Everyone turned to look at him. "I know this is hard," he said, looking at all of us, "and I don't expect it to be easy, but I want to try." His gaze met mine. "If you'll let me." I swallowed past the lump in my throat. For so long, I had thought the hardest part of this journey would be proving I existed. But maybe the hardest part was deciding what to do with that existence now. I looked around the table, at the family I had never known. And then, for the first time that night, I allowed myself to hope. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Maybe we can try." Weeks passed after that dinner, and slowly things began to shift. The cold, distant gap between Daniel's family and me started to warm, little by little. Ava and I didn't become best friends overnight, but we found a common ground. Henry, with his enthusiasm for basketball and his knack for asking the most random questions, helped to bridge the awkwardness. We didn't talk about everything at once. There was no rush to make everything okay, but we began spending time together. And in doing so, I realized that there was no perfect solution to this mess. No magical moment where everything clicked into place. It was simply about taking one step at a time, day by day. Daniel, too, made an effort. At first, it felt forced, like he was going through the motions of being a father, but over time, his efforts grew more genuine. He invited me to more family events, included me in small conversations, and apologized, not just for the past, but for the emotional distance he had maintained. At some point, I realized I wasn't waiting for him to prove anything anymore. I wasn't seeking his approval. I had spent so many years building myself into someone strong and independent that I no longer needed his validation to feel worthy. It wasn't that I had forgiven him entirely, it was that I had forgiven myself. And in that forgiveness, I started to accept the messy reality of my family. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't ideal, but it was mine. One Sunday, months after that dinner, I found myself at a family barbecue at Daniel's house. It was small, casual, with burgers sizzling on the grill and Henry chasing a soccer ball around the backyard. Ava was on her phone, still as cool as ever, but even she had loosened up a little. Daniel was talking to a neighbor, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just an outsider watching them from the outside looking in. I felt like I belonged, in my own imperfect way. As I stood there, I realized something. My journey hadn't been about chasing a relationship with Daniel or fitting into a picture-perfect family. It had been about learning to trust myself, to believe that my worth wasn't defined by anyone else's expectations or shortcomings. I had spent so much of my life feeling abandoned, isolated, but I had learned that my sense of belonging came from within. It wasn't about whether Daniel would come through, it was about whether I would come through for myself. I walked over to where Daniel stood by the grill, the sounds of laughter and conversation filling the air. "Hey," I said, nudging him lightly, "you think you could show me how to flip one of these burgers without burning it?" He looked over at me, a surprised smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You sure? It's an art form," I chuckled. "I'll take my chances." And for the first time in all this time, I didn't feel like a child trying to force a place in a world that had never really wanted me. I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be, not because everything was perfect, but because I had come to terms with the fact that it never would be. Life was messy and it was hard, but it was also beautiful in its own right. As I flipped a burger under Daniel's watchful eye, I glanced around at the people in this strange new world. Ava was laughing with Henry, and Daniel was laughing with a friend. I realized then that this was what I had been searching for all along. Not an ideal family, not the perfect reconciliation, but a sense of belonging that didn't depend on perfection. I didn't need to be fixed. I didn't need anyone to complete me. I was already whole. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the yard, I finally felt a sense of peace settle over me. Not because everything was resolved, but because I had come to understand that the journey itself, the struggle, the pain, the growth, was what had made me who I was. And for once, I was okay with that. It had been a long road, filled with challenges I had never anticipated, but I was stronger now, wiser. And in the quiet of that moment, with the sound of laughter and the warmth of the grill beside me, I knew I was finally home. As the evening drew to a close, I found myself standing on the edge of the porch, gazing out at the fading light. The air was cool now, the remnants of summer slipping quietly away. The sounds of the family inside, the clinking of plates, the murmurs of conversation faded into the background, leaving me with a strange sense of stillness. I had spent so long trying to find my place in a world that had never quite fit. And now, as I looked at the people I had come to know, I realized that I didn't need to force it. I didn't need to make everything perfect. I had made peace with my past, not because I had forgotten the pain or the mistakes, but because I had learned to move forward without letting them define me. I wasn't the person I had been when I walked into Daniel's life. I was someone who had faced the darkness, learned from it, and emerged stronger. I was someone who had chosen to heal, to embrace the unknown, and to see the potential in every new day. The future was uncertain, like it always had been. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt. But for the first time, I knew I was ready. As I turned to head back inside, the door swung open and Henry ran out with his soccer ball, grinning from ear to ear. "Hey, Elijah, you want to play?" I smiled and nodded, the warmth of the invitation filling me with a sense of quiet joy. "Sure," I said, stepping forward into the night. There was a whole world waiting ahead of me, one I would face not alone, but with strength and hope. It wasn't about knowing the exact path, but about being brave enough to walk it. And with that, I knew I was ready for whatever came next.